Yep. 7 o'clock, we'll call the Board of Selectmen Wastewater Subcommittee meeting to order. First, I'd like to welcome folks from Chatham, starting with the two selectmen, Dean DeCastro and Jeff Dykens, Town Manager, Jill Goldsmith, Director of Natural Resources, Bob Duncanson, Alex, and I can't remember your last name, Finance Director. And just want to thank you for the continued effort to come up with a memorandum of understanding to bring before our voters at our next town meeting. Jeff?
So where do we leave off, and what would you like to talk about? We have a document in front of us that you guys circulated around.
We did, and I think what I would do is, unless Angelo has something?
No, I think it'd be best if Chris would walk us all through the document.
Yeah, yeah.
And then we can talk about what changes we want to make, how we want to proceed with going forward, and where the issues may or may not be.
Okay, super.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just in terms of what we have before you this evening, this is not a lot very different than what we've already presented. Really, I thought what would be of some value is just, especially when we have a few folks here, just to go through each of the concepts to see what the concepts are, and then I'll make a recommendation at the end as to a way to proceed forward. I would just say I think that we should focus on an IMA and not necessarily do a memorandum of understanding to lead to an IMA. That just seems to be overly bureaucratic in my mind. So
It's going to waste some time, I think, but yeah.
the focal point in my mind would be to kind of get the framework of an agreement and put it into an IMA.
I would agree. We would agree, Chris. Yeah.
So in terms of that, the first item or first area would be purchase capacity. I think what this lays out is, we know that obviously Chatham built the facility. We know that you had a total cost to do that. The town of Harwich is interested in buying some of that capacity. Obviously the plant was built to treat a certain amount, 1.3 initially, and then I think 2.2 at the far end of it. So the concept here would be to have, according to our CWMP, we anticipate having about 300,000 gallons per day going in. So we want to buy into that capacity at this point. And the concept here would be that if it's rated for, the capacity is 1.3 and you take 300,000 gallons per day, that's about 23% of the total cost. I know on the Harwich side, there is some real concern about 23% of the net number and not the gross number. So if there were grants or other things that were paid by the federal government, let's figure out what those are. But the concept is that we would buy that section. And then, and I did modify this, and this is just at least for discussion purposes. Once we make the verification of the costs, then I broke out an initial payment that would be 25% of that total cost when we start flowing the material to Chatham. And then I just picked 25% when we get over 50,000 gallons per day, 25 when we get over 150, and 25 when we get to the 250. So some kind of build-up, if you would, to that. Again, that's just at least an initial concept. In terms of the other piece to this is that in the second part of the first one, we have the once we complete the sewering, what happens if there's a decision to make, or when Chatham reaches a decision to go from the 1.3 up to the 2.2, is there an opportunity at that point that if there is capacity and if Harwich believes that there's additional need in Harwich to send more material, this clause just gives both sides the opportunity to discuss an expanded capacity if that is deemed to be in the best interest of the two sides. So I think really the second part of that is to deal with when Chatham does the expansion, if Harwich has an interest, and then anything above and beyond, and once the plant goes beyond that 1.3 million, and Harwich wants to go above the 300, and if Chatham's willing, that we'll talk about a additional capacity if it's there. So I think that just gives us the ability, both towns, the ability to talk about that as we move forward. The second item on this is O&M cost payments. This one, I realized after last night's meeting that I need to tweak this a little bit more. But really, in my mind, item 1 dealt with the capital and buying into the capital infrastructure that Chatham has already built. And here we get into the O&M piece. O&M, just for folks, I probably use too many shortcuts, just operation and maintenance costs of the facility over there. And we do break it down into fixed costs, which are what we've identified, at least some of those as, I know you have contract operations, so you have Weston and Sampson actually operates the plant. In my mind, that's a fixed cost. So if the plant operates at the 1.3, we have 300,000, then we would pay the 23.07%, just a simple product of math, towards those fixed costs. I did include in here that we would have to exclude indirect costs and debt service. If we're paying the capital costs in number 1, then we wouldn't pay it again in number 2 as part of O&M. One thing that came up last night, 2 points that came up last night is, I think if you have a budget that you approve, Chatham approves, just we'll look at the budget and see what your costs that are indirect and not indirect to get a sense for what those items are, so we can at least group those appropriately. The other thing that came up last night is the 23% is based upon the current design capacity of the 1.3. If you go to the 2.2 and all that additional capacity is only Chatham, then that percentage needs to be adjusted accordingly, because it would no longer be 23%. So that was something that kind of came up last night. And then on flow variable operation and maintenance in a operation of a treatment plant, there's a very high amount of costs that go into chemicals for the treatment of the material, electricity and sludge disposal, just to name a few. And on that, those variable flow costs, we're looking at doing that as an actual percentage. So as the meter for the pump station records how much material is being sent from from Harwich to Chatham, we would be able to take that flow and do that as a percentage. And whatever the amount is, I think that's pretty straightforward, a fairly equitable way of approaching that, and the pump stations can have meters built into them, so that's something that is fairly easily recordable. On the item number 3 is the effluent recharge. That, and actually Bob can speak much better this than I can, but it's basically, I guess my understanding that right now the site does process material and then sends it out, and there's still a determination that needs to be made as to whether it goes to Cockle Cove or out to Nantucket Sound. If it goes out to Nantucket Sound, then that would be fairly efficient flow and not have any environmental impacts. If it goes to Cockle Cove, then there is the potential that Harwich would have to take treated material back and do a recharge site in East Harwich. Obviously, the town did try last year, unsuccessfully, but did try to identify a site and obtain a site. We are back at it again this year. We have identified 2 sites as potential, and we would have the study. The idea in this is to have a triggering mechanism, whether it's DEP saying that you need to have to find the recharge site in Harwich, or here we have a mechanism where it's 80% of the permitted capacity. So once you hit 80%, if Harwich material puts you over, then Harwich would have to take the material back. So this just provides a trigger point, if you would, for that opportunity for Harwich to go through and implement its plan. It does say, I think on the Harwich side, that we would prepare a plan to accept the recharge effluent. Again, effluent is processed material. It's basically clean water being returned to the town of Harwich. So it's not raw materials. So, and then obviously the cost for the recharge site is all would be borne by the town of Harwich. I think the only other thing in that is taking the recharge materials. Obviously, because the plant is in Chatham, there would have to be an easement in order to be able to put the piping in to go from Chatham into Harwich. So we would just need to have the mechanism to go from the plant to the site. So I think that is important to have in the agreement, the ability to take the material back and at least have that But obviously, that would be determined. And that is a decision point that, quite honestly, may happen in 20 years from now.
Yeah.
So it potentially is a long way off. The item number 4 is the connection to Chatham. Basically, in order for us to get the material, it would go from a force main. They have it as pump station number 6 is what's being called in the plan. And it would have, the pump station would be installed by the Chatham Town line and head into the Chatham Wastewater Treatment Facility. The estimated cost for the Harwich, where we would basically plug in the Harwich system into the Chatham, that our portion of that, at least the estimated portion at this point, is about 2.4 million. Since you're taking Harwich flow to get to the facility, it only makes sense that Harwich would pay for those costs. It is at least envisioned in here that we would do a joint application to the State Revolving Loan Fund. The State Revolving Loan Fund, again, just for some of the folks maybe in the audience, the state generated a funding mechanism to do water and wastewater. The value of that, it actually acts as a bank, and usually the interest rate is about 2%, so it's a fairly modest interest rate. So it's always advantageous. Plus, you don't have a lot of your loan origination costs because it's a state agency that basically oversees that. So anytime we have the ability to finance things through the State Revolving Loan Fund, it's certainly to the advantages of both towns. On the metered flow, here we just talk about that it would be actual flows from the pump station at that pump station 6. So we're talking about that the meter would be installed at that. There is occasion, and I did have some experience in my previous town, that even though you have a system where you plug everything in the previous town and potentially here, you may have the odd home where it makes more sense to plug in after that meter. So a Harwich home may be more efficient to plug directly into the line after that meter or pump station. So this just has a provision that we would take the water flow and just add that in as part of our total flow to Chatham. So that way we account for that. But that, again, is probably going to be kind of one-offs. I don't envision that there would be a substantial number, but I know in my previous experience that does happen, so. On the...
Just 1 second, Chris, though, a Harwich resident would plug into the Harwich side, that would be part of the metered flow.
Yeah, just on,
Yeah.
the way it would work is if we had 95% of the homes, let's say, would be plugged in, and then, I'm not good on all the streets, would it be coming up Queen Anne Road to head towards the plant? There is a possibility that there would be a Harwich house after,
Yeah.
that due to the proximity of that line, it would be better to have them hook up after. So in this case, for that home, you would want to be compensated for the flow going into your line. We would take the water meter consumption and just use that to determine how much flow is going in. So it's really for the one-offs.
Water meter is a proxy for the...
Yeah, in my experience, I've been in several different towns where we've had water and sewer, and generally you use the water meter as the number for sewer. I know I do talk fast, so please, anytime.
No, I don't mean to be, I just wondered how, an unmetered wastewater, how would unmetered wastewater get there?
Well,
exactly
that's what
we just
we're
described.
talking
That's what we
about
just
from the
described.
houses.
Got it, okay, I had it circled with a question mark, thank you very much. That's
Okay.
helpful.
On the wastewater flow, that things would be determined based upon gallons per day, so just making sure we have the right measurement. There are different tools that you can use. I think gallons per day makes the most sense, average daily flow in gallons per day. On the billing, the concept would be that Chatham would send a bill to Harwich, and then Harwich would bill the customers directly. So once we get the bill, we would do all the billing requirements. On the sewer system maintenance, that right now, it's my understanding that Chatham obviously has a contract ops that operate your plant. I believe Weston and Sampson is the current vendor. For us, if we have approximately 500 homes that are hooked up, it doesn't really make sense for us to build our own sewer department to monitor that system. What makes more sense is to do a add-on to the Weston and Sampson contract, because you already have them as a vendor. They're already doing maintenance on your distribution side, and see if we could just expand, and then Harwich would be responsible for any costs related to that component of maintenance of the system. On the, number 9 is to adopt the wastewater regulations that are equal to or greater than the Chatham wastewater regulations. I believe DEP kind of requires that if you put a water ban in place, we would have to take water conservation measures. So I think that that's something that DEP would kind of push that. On item number 10, to create an advisory board in which the two towns would meet on a quarterly basis just to kind of monitor the agreement and see how things are going in case there's any changes that would have to be made as we move forward.
Who are your sewer commissioners? Is the selectmen, or do you have a separate board?
Right now, we're still in the process of determining a governance model. By state law, I think by default, it goes directly to the selectmen, but we are trying to do something with our water commission. The water commission obviously is in a similar business, but the governance model hasn't been fully determined yet. On the time frame for the implementation of the IMA, one of the things that basically I think what this is trying to get at is there has to be a sequencing of events. One obviously is there would be the buy-in into the Chatham system. The other is that it's going to take us, I think it's about, the estimate is about 2 years to design the East Harwich flow, the East Harwich system, and then it would probably take about 2 years to construct. So even if we sign this today, it's probably going to be 3 to 4 years before it really becomes operative. So I think we just need to make sure that we establish timelines on both sides, because we don't want to build our system and then not have a pipe to plug it into. And obviously, that just requires coordination on the two towns to make sure we work together. So that's kind of the overview. My, I guess, suggestion or recommendation is when I negotiated one of these in my last community, it was really the two managers, or the two administrators that got together, and we used the resources of the engineers to provide some assistance. And we sat down, went through the material, and said, you know, what do we need to do? Does this make sense? And then I think it makes sense to have staff kind of draft it and then bring it back to, you know, this group and see if everyone's comfortable with that. So at least as a process going forward, I'm more than happy to work with, you know, Jill, Alex, Bob. I work with Bob all the time anyway on Muddy Creek, so we've established a pretty good working rapport. And then perhaps the engineers, GDR, is that? GHD. Got it wrong twice. But, you know, it may make sense to have them, and we would have Dave Young from CDM join us. Just to, I found that some of these things, you know, certain design criteria that we don't want to lose sight of that will have issues, and having them at the table makes a lot of sense, just to make sure we don't have any significant faux pas. But that would be the suggestion I would have to the two boards moving forward.
Okay, you know, that was a great summary, Chris. I can tell that, or you've been through this before?
I have, yes.
Yeah, yeah. It's very logical, it's well laid out, the concepts. I mean, I certainly don't have any major issues with the concepts. I do think we need to pound away at the dollars and make sure we're all comfortable with amounts. My initial reaction to your suggestion of doing the 25% as you go was positive. I think that's fair as an approach. I think that kind of graduated approach is fair. I think the concept of the O&M cost payments is also reasonable. I noted that you picked up excluding the indirect costs and debt service because you've already paid for it, so why pay for it twice? I mean, I think that's it's a fine suggestion. And then kind of just the effluent recharge. You know, you're right. A lot of this stuff's going to happen, you know, I don't know, you know, a long time in the future. But, you know, so I probably won't anticipate every single thing but I think that paying attention to, you know, the different possible contingencies and trying to anticipate, you know, what might happen or not happen and how we would react accordingly was well laid out. So So those are my initial reactions. In terms of getting the town managers together with Bob and engineers and stuff, that's probably a pretty smart way to go too. It's probably more efficient than us getting together all the time and pounding this out. I think we have some work to do on the numbers. I don't know if we came prepared tonight to talk about numbers, but.
Yeah, no, I think if we just do concepts at this point.
So, you know, my initial reaction to the whole notion of sharing, and it is sharing, we've made a considerable investment in the plant. It's a wonderful asset, and I think it makes a lot of sense, a lot of common sense to share so that the town of Harwich doesn't have to incur the same type of expense in East Harwich and also on the other side of town. It seems foolish to have the town of Harwich make that kind of sizable investment, and it's a sizable investment, tens of millions of dollars. So anyway, I think it makes a lot of sense to share a regional solution here, especially in that area where Pleasant Bay is so sensitive, and it's just, we just want to do the best we can and the most we can to keep that area of the Cape, the lower Cape, clean and pristine, and we're doing a good job in Muddy Creek as well, you know, and so it makes a lot of sense. Those are my reactions, and they haven't changed since the last time we met. And I'll hand it off to Dean and others.
I just had one conceptual comment about the initial payment of 25%. And I'm in agreement with Jeff about, and your suggestion that there be an installment program here. Does that work for us, Bob? Because we're in effect going to be reserving 23% of our capacity for Harwich for a period of time. And as I read this, the initial payment comes in only once the system is operational.
Correct.
Looks like.
Correct.
And I know when we talked amongst ourselves, I'm not sure we were just talking in that.
Yeah, in previous discussions, and, you know, both internally and I think even with Harwich going back, there had been some discussion about, we'll call it an upfront payment, if you will, probably at the time the IMA is signed. And I think we were talking somewhere in the number of 10%. You know, as you indicate, we're gonna reserve capacity for Harwich. You know, recognizing there aren't a lot of other towns that could potentially, you know, be knocking at the door at the same time. But just something to indicate the commitment, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and the fact that we are setting aside and gonna be doing things, you know, in terms of Chatham's implementation, maybe out of sequence from what we might otherwise have done them. So just to recognize that, you know, and keep it down around the 10% is kind of a token.
Would the IMA be signed before or after the various town votes are taken?
Yeah, actually, that's a good point. I think.
Because that has a bearing on this too.
I think technically, by law, both boards of selectmen can enter into an IMA on their own. I know in here, we would want to make sure that town meetings, you know, town meeting is the one that ultimately has to decide on the money pieces.
Yep.
And so that they know upfront what's coming and what's been agreed to, that we do have the clause in there that they both become operative upon both town meetings basically ratifying it. So it's not needed officially by law, but I think it's prudent to make sure that we do that.
I think we'd want to go to town meeting too.
Absolutely.
I think that probably means for us that by January, we would like to have an agreement at a pretty good stage so we could bring it to the next town meeting.
We try to get our warrant done beginning of January, so it would be
Same here,
operative.
same timetable. You have a May meeting, right? Is it a May meeting?
May meeting.
May meeting.
Other reaction?
You know, I think Bob raises the issue that we've looked at is, you know, what's the reservation of capacity and what's it mean, and so forth. So I think we could have some more discussion about where we're going to. We've met as our own subcommittee as well, and there's a couple of talking points. But I think that the idea of moving towards the IMA now makes a lot of sense because I think we've all endorsed the concept. So you've briefed your board, we had briefed our board before, and I think it's time for another update to our Board of Selectmen. But I think it's the way to go. And we can hash out purchase capacity. I did note some changes from the last version.
Yes.
So what we'll probably do is just try to get a legislative or marked up copy. Because I know our town council had commented on it. before, so.
And I do think, just to make a suggestion, that if both towns can kind of agree, I think we should get the concepts kind of agreed to, and then let the attorneys kind of go through the, put it into a form that makes sense, but it keeps to the intent. I always think it's better to have the professionals draft the concepts and then have the attorneys make sure that we didn't do anything inappropriate in it. But, I'd like to just see if we can get things, at least the concepts down, and then we'll turn it over to the respective attorneys to.
How are we going to, or when are we going to deal with, those remaining numbers where we're not solid yet? For example, as you mentioned in your presentation, Chris, what is the number of which the 23%, is taken from? Is it, as you said, we paid $41 million for the facility, and you talked about recognizing grant monies and so forth.
Yeah,
I don't know that we've reached any.
Yeah, no, and I think that's gonna be very, very important for the Harwich side,
Yeah.
obviously. But I think from even, I don't know if you have it on the website, that it was 40 million, but the
Yeah,
after.
we're actually, in response to the last meeting we had, Alex and I have been working on refining all those numbers, making sure we've got everything that we think should be in there accounted for. Alex has been working on the interest side of it,
Okay.
because that was kind of the one thing we didn't have last time, was the interest side. So I think, very shortly, we'd be able to sit down with you guys and say, okay, here's our numbers, and walk through it so you understand everything that we've included in it, and why we've included in it, frankly, why we think it's important that number be in there, and look at the grant offsets and things like that. So I think we're probably pretty close to being able to sit down and
Okay, so we're
hash
talking,
that number
so that
out.
would be worked out on the town manager level with professional staff, and then you'd come back to us.
Yes.
Okay.
I think it's one of those projects and where it's fortunate that we can work together
Yes.
because we both have benefits
Yes.
from them, so I think that's important. And the other,
It's a natural fit, I think.
well, the other benefit is, since the county and the state wants people to work regionally and cooperate, they may see the advantage of providing us with some either loans or other funds at a good price, which, as soon as we get moving on this, could be very helpful.
Yep. I hope.
Uh,
Yeah, we're farsighted, I hope.
One of the things that always comes up is the recharge. If we have a second, can you summarize quickly, because I know there's some people here who are interested in that whole area, the nature of the recharge situation?
Could I tack a question onto that?
Sure.
Because I was.
No.
I'm sorry.
No. It
Go ahead,
follows,
Mr.
it follows from what Chris was saying, because it kind of, I was surprised to hear it, as I don't know how it fits in, but you mentioned Cockle Cove and Nantucket Sound.
Yeah.
And I sort of thought the recharge was gonna go into our pits over.
It does.
It does.
It does.
All right.
It
And
does.
and that's where it ultimately winds up.
Yeah.
Right.
All right, thank you, that's, okay.
Yeah, just very quickly, I mean, the recharge that we have at the Chatham facility is what's known as rapid infiltration beds. And so, we often talk about the Cape being a big sandbar, and in this location, it really is. So basically what you do is you run the wastewater through the treatment plant, and by the time you get to the end with our process, you've basically got water that looks pretty close to this. And we then take that, and we've gone out immediately adjacent to the plant, you strip off all the vegetation, you strip off all the topsoil, and we basically get down to sand, which underlies most of the Cape. And you create these large beds, basically sand, and you pipe the wastewater out into those beds. It discharges out of a pipe, and in our case, because the sand is so porous, there's a concrete collar around the pipe where it discharges. The water flows over that and immediately back into the ground. And so all you see is a wet area that, the collars are about 6 feet in diameter. You see a wet area that may go out 3 or 4 feet beyond that, and that's all it is. There's generally no puddling in the water. There's no ponding, they're not open lagoons or anything like that. The water spills out and immediately back into the ground. And in the case of our site, we've got roughly 40 to 60 feet of sand before that water gets back into the underlying groundwater. Because remember, there's groundwater underlying the entire cape, and so basically we're taking this treated wastewater and recharging it back into the aquifer from whence we pumped it with our public water supply wells or private wells. And what Chris was alluding to is, and if I'm going too far, just stop me. Groundwater flow on the south side of Route 6 generally flows towards Nantucket Sound. And any embayments like Weechmere Harbor, Saquatucket, Stage Harbor in Chatham, all those southern embayment systems that we have. In some cases, that groundwater surfaces in those embayments. In other cases, it underflows them entirely and ultimately surfaces in Nantucket Sound. And that's somewhat the underlying question behind the decision as to whether or not at some point Harwich may have to take flow back and recharge it in Harwich. There's some question as to exactly how much we can safely recharge the Chatham site without violating any state limits or standards that have been set. It's a decision that we won't have to make until we're up close to 1 million gallon a day discharge. Right now, we're only at about 150,000 to 200,000 gallons a day on an annual average. Obviously flows are higher in the summer than they are in the winter, but the state looks at these things on a year-round average. So it's a decision we do not need to make in the short term. It's a longer-term decision, and we're going to be working with the state as well as USGS to refine and see exactly where that recharged water ends up. Does it all surface in those inshore embayments, or as USGS says, based on some work they did, maybe greater than 50% of it actually underflows those embayments and ends up in Nantucket Sound. Now, that's not to say that it doesn't have an impact on Nantucket Sound. It does, but Nantucket Sound can handle a lot more nitrogen than these smaller embayment systems that don't flush as well. So that's basically, quickly, I hope,
Thank you.
what you were looking for.
So if it ultimately winds up in Harwich, years down the line, what Harwich would be building are basically these sand pits.
Well, you really have two options. One is you could build the sand pits like we have. The other option is to build a system that's basically underground. What some communities do. Oak Bluffs is a prime example. If you're familiar with Oak Bluffs, just adjacent to the ferry terminal, there's a huge park area, and their wastewater recharge is actually underneath that.
Is that right?
So basically very similar to what you do on a household system, you basically put a series of pipes underground with stone around them, then you fill over the top of it and create your yard or a ball field or something like that. And that way, it's still working, but you just don't see it. That tends to be way more expensive. You need a much larger area because you don't get as much percolation the way that system's set up. And so if you can do the open beds like we have, we're lucky. I've got, a commerce park on one side, we've got a capped landfill on the other side, we have conservation land in the other two directions. So for us, the open beds were much cheaper and easier to do. But if you have limitations where you don't have that kind of perfect site, you can always go the underground option. Should go through.
Don't mind, stand up at the podium,
No, the microphone.
right in the middle, thank you.
Sorry.
They just want to make sure they capture it for TV.
Well, okay, the question on the sand pit, all right, which is what my understanding is that they may be considering in back of our houses, all right? The fact that it's above ground, is there noise involved? Because this is going to be very close to our backyards.
No.
Even if it's above ground, you don't hear any water running, there's,
If you're standing right next to it, like if that was the discharge point, that table, and I was standing over here, you'd hear water kind of trickling out. But as soon as you got any distance away, you wouldn't hear anything at all. Because, when I say the water's coming out of the pipe, if this is the concrete surface, the water may be coming up this high, and then it's just flowing across the concrete. It's not shooting out of the water like an oil well kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's just kind of bubbling out and then dispersing across the surface and back into the ground.
And there is no odor involved? No odor and no noise?
If there's any odor at all, it should smell like composted soil. And frankly, if there is an odor, that's an indication to us there's some kind of a problem. But most wastewater treatment plants, if there's an odor, it's restricted to a very limited area. And that would be up more where the treatment process is, not where the disposal is. Because like I say, at our plant right now, by the time you get to the end, the water looks like this.
All right.
Because of the process we use. And I'll extend the invitation to those of you here in the room. Obviously, I can't extend it to the entire community. But I actually have some folks that are coming from Harwich on Friday. Oh, okay. To come over and take a look and see what it looks like,
All right,
so.
all right,
It is a fascinating tour. It is very, very interesting.
all right.
Fascinating.
We were just a little concerned because this is, the site that they're honing in on is just about in our backyard.
Yeah.
So we
Yeah,
are-
if it's nothing more than rapid infiltration beds, if the soil conditions are good, so the water doesn't pond or anything like that, I would not foresee it being an issue.
All right. Thank you.
And you'll be able to see it for yourself.
Yeah.
Bob, I guess my question is it put under pressure in Chatham, and then it comes to East Harwich, and it just comes out of a pipe, or is there any kind of pumping station in East Harwich to go ahead and bring it into from Chatham? I'm wondering how, what kind of
Wastewater
pressure-
side or treated water going back?
The recharged water coming back
Recharged
to
water.
Harwich.
It would really depend on where the Harwich site is, how far away it is from the plant. I know originally when you were looking at the site in East Harwich, or the first site that you talked about last year, one pump station at the Chatham plant would have been enough to get it from point A to point B.
Okay,
If you're now talking about moving the recharge to West Harwich someplace,
Sure.
there might need to be another supplemental pump station in between. It's really a question of distance and vertical height.
okay.
In terms of where you need to get it from to where you need to get it to. But I suspect more than likely only the one pump station will be needed. I mean, we send treated wastewater right now from downtown Chatham
Yes,
all the way down to the wastewater treatment plant, which is a distance of about 3 miles with one pump station.
okay.
And the distance from our plant up to East Harwich is less than that, so.
And that pump station is located within your facility?
The concept that we've talked about is, yes, that pump station will be located at our treatment plant.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Okay.
Any other questions or comments, or, I think this has gone quite well.
Good.
Very close, I think.
Do we want to set a time for a follow-up?
I think it's up to the town managers and
Yeah, I
Staff,
think
Bob,
that
others.
one thing that may be helpful is if you guys are close to getting the numbers, then why don't we let them get the numbers and then we'll meet pretty shortly after that. I mean, if you want to continue to drive the process and give us deadlines, it's probably not a bad idea.
I think we will.
But maybe,
we have our own, to be honest with you, I think we all have deadlines. I mean, if you want to get to town meeting, I think
That's what I was
that's
thinking.
impetus enough, that's enough
maybe
motivation.
just kind of thinking out loud, November 15th or something like that.
We can leave it open and do it.
You
via
wanna leave it
email.
open?
You can update us, and then we'll set a date.
Okay. I'm fine by that.
We wanted to get a copy of your wastewater regulations.
Yeah, that's a
That-
great idea. Yeah. And frankly, I didn't mention it, but we were pleased to see that clause in the draft here, because that's critical. You have to adopt them, I mean.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm pleased that conceptually we seem to be
Yeah, no.
fine. It's
we're-
now getting down to the nitty
Well,
gritty.
it's common sense, Angela.
I know.
It just is. It's common sense.
So,
Great. Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Very good.
You're welcome.